What is up, and welcome to the first edition of the Lakers Theory podcast, a podcast about Lakers basketball. I'm one of your two co-hosts, Shane Jackson. The other one is Austin Case, my best friend and a lifelong Lakers fan. And that's the reason why we're doing this. We'll get into that, but he is a diehard, lifelong Lakers fan, and we have just constantly been texting each other about Lakers basketball and blowing up our group meets, and nobody cares but us. So that's why we were doing this podcast. Austin, explain how this came about and what we're doing here.
Yeah, so you kind of summed it up, really, to an extent. You know, you joined the Lakers fandom with me when LeBron came aboard. And so it turned into us chatting about games during the game, what's going on. You know, post-game, we're talking about things, blowing up the group me. And as the only two Lakers fans in our friend group, I can only assume that they found it annoying. And so we just decided to start a podcast so we have the chance to talk about it together, but also hopefully reach, a similar group of people that like to listen to Lakers information.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. Disclaimer, we're two fans from Kansas. So I don't know how difficult that's going to be in terms of podcast setting and all that. And today's show is the first one of Lakers Theory podcast. So I want it to be an evergreen podcast where anybody can go back to it at any point and listen to it and know what they're getting when they listen to this podcast. So we're not going to dive into too many specifics, but today is basically what we've kind of hit on already, but it's what to expect from this podcast. It's, our own little background to get to know us, because I think that will be very important. If you have a better understanding of us, then that'll make your podcast listening a little bit better. Then we will touch on the 2020 postseason, because I think it will be relevant for a while now. And maybe if we have time, get to some offseason stuff, because the offseason is right around the corner. We're recording this on Saturday, November 14th. It'll probably be posted here in a couple of days. But again, this will be evergreen. And at any point, you can go back to it and say, hey, this is what I'm getting from a podcast by fans for fans. So let's get into it. This is the Lakers Theory podcast. So let's explain what we want to do here. And I think let's start with the name first. It was created by you from a podcast name generator, but I think it ended up being the perfect name because it's a theory, and it's our theory basically on the Lakers basketball team. We're not trying to pretend like we are covering the team. We're not trying to pretend like it's our job to know the ins and outs. This is going to be a podcast by fans for fans. And so I think it will be good to get that raw emotion insight after games, and that you would normally say as a fan if you were just talking to another fan, a fellow fan. Is that to the extent of what you envision this podcast being?
Yeah, I think that's perfect. And back to the name picking. I found the name generator. I typed in Lakers. That's it, and kind of it. I mean, it was page after page, and I saw Lakers Theory, and so I pitched it to you, and it stuck. But yeah, it's just our theory on things that happens with the Lakers, if it be off season, post game, what to look forward to. And so I just think it's going to be good in terms of information we can put out there, our take on that information. So really that's what it boils down to, just our take on things and how we perceive it.
And I think it's important to say up front that I don't personally have any expectations for this podcast. I understand there's a lot of podcasts out there in the world. As someone who's subscribed to, probably over 30 podcasts alone in a sports world, I know that there's too many podcasts out there, and it comes to figuring out what you want and what you like. So I don't envision, I don't have any expectations of this being huge and saying, hey, we need to get to a certain number of listeners every week or whatever it is per show. I just view it personally as this is like an online journal. This is going to be a chance for us, instead of just texting each other what our thoughts are, we're just going to talk it out right here. And I don't care how many people end up listening to what we have to say, but I will enjoy this. We'll get into our own fandom or whatever, but I came to the Lakers through LeBron, and I don't know how many years left of LeBron being awesome we have. So I think this year in particular, I want to enjoy every game that he is on, and I want to talk it out afterwards and discuss it with my best friend. So for me, this is a chance to bond with Austin, and it's essentially an online journal for me. Is that your expectation, or what do you hope to get out of this?
If we blew up, it would be amazing. But Kansas Lakers, I think we got a long shot. But yeah, it's just an opportunity for us to talk with each other about things that are happening in the Lakers world. If we reach other people, great. If our significant others are the only people who whatever. It really boils down to just being able to interact and talk about Lakers basketball. I've loved Lakers basketball for a long time, so I finally have that opportunity to share it with somebody, and so that's the most important part.
Yeah, and there's not going to be a time limit on this podcast or any podcast in general. For me, I think this is going to be, hey, let's get our unfiltered thoughts. I don't know what the schedule is going to allow us to do. Being Lakers fans in Kansas makes it difficult to maybe watch a West Coast game and immediately record a podcast after it. I mean, that would obviously be a dream scenario, I think. But I know you have a real adult job where you have to wake up the next morning, and that's not always going to be feasible. So when we figure out a schedule, we will get to it. And we will let you know, anybody who's listening to this on a regular basis. And there won't be any time limit. And maybe if there are live shows, because the platform we are using, you're allowed to stream this live. And if there are listeners, watching or listening live, they can interact as well. There's comment sections. There's a way to chime in the conversation as well. Because again, being fans, I think this is for the fans. And so including everybody is probably the way to go in this situation. So let's get into that. Let's get into our own backgrounds of this and how this came about, because I think what is going to be unique about this podcast is that both of us have unique backgrounds, not only from a Lakers fandom perspective, but just in life. And so I think it's going to create a nice balance for this podcast. So let's start with Austin first, because he is, of the two of us, the diehard lifelong Lakers fan. And I think that's important to get to right away, because I think there's a lot of people who are going to watch this and relate more to what Austin has to say, because he's just going to, after a loss, he's going to want to cut everybody and trade everybody. So Austin, tell us about how you became a Lakers fan and your background just in general.
Well, I think I remember it was the early 2000s, probably. I think 2001 was the last of the three-peat with Kobe and Shaq, and that's when I first started getting real serious into sports. I would always watch, Sunday football or KU basketball with my grandpa, and so that was about the extent of it for most of the time. And then I started venturing out, and 2001, at that time period, it was Lakers and Kobe and Shaq. So naturally, I drifted towards the best team in the world. And then it just stuck, I fell in love with watching Kobe play basketball. He just wanted to be better than anyone every day, every second. And that kind of stuck with me just in life. And once we started playing sports, I wanted to be better. And so really, Kobe kind of, it all came down to watching Kobe play basketball. And then once he retired, I stayed. I was loyal. I wanted to continue to support the Lakers. And then, we're here. I get to enjoy this with you now.
Yeah. So I'm a new Lakers fan. Some would even call me a bandwagon Lakers fan, and that would be accurate. For starting my NBA fandom, I fell in love with Dwayne Wade. And then when LeBron went to the Heat, I basically became a LeBron fan by default. And then I just started following LeBron everywhere because I watched him play basketball and said, holy crap, I've never seen someone so good at basketball. And it just became so amazing to watch the way he played and the style that he played in. And I just fell in love with LeBron basically playing basketball. And I got to be in Cleveland when he won a title there, and that added an element as well. I got to storm downtown right after they beat the Warriors in that incredible comeback. So when he went to the Lakers, I, without question, joined the Lakers bandwagon because that's what I had done in the past. I just followed LeBron everywhere. But I have enjoyed the last couple of years in particular, mostly because I got to experience this fandom with you. You know, in the past with the Cavs or the Heat, I didn't have anyone to talk about. I just said, hey, LeBron's awesome. And most of my other friends said, yeah, he's great. But nobody cared as much. So no, that this has made it even more special. And we'll get into the 2020 postseason as well. But, you know, being able to, even in this COVID world, watch all these games with you, whether it was in person or over Zoom or whatever we tried to do, I thought that was special. And it's something I will remember forever. But what I wanted to get into was our more specific backgrounds, and I think it adds to it a little bit as well. I bring a journalism experience background to this. So I think, you know, maybe after a loss, I won't be as hard on the team as Austin. I cover college sports and high school sports here in Kansas. So KU basketball, KU football, and high school sports. And so I bring a element of, hey, being able to analyze things and process losses in a certain way that I think will bring a nice balance to this, because Austin, after a loss, might just say, hey, let's fire the entire team, or everything is doomed, or vice versa. If they win, he says this team's going to be the best and they're going to go 82-0. I guess 72-0 this year. So no, I personally think that's going to create a nice balance as well. Don't get me wrong, there are going to be games where I get emotional as well. I just think my journalism experience has allowed me to maybe accept losses or certain games a little bit better. I'm still not great at it by any means, but what do you say, Austin? Will that create a nice balance? And I guess, what do you envision, how you envision reacting after a loss or a win?
I do think our backgrounds, you as a journalist and me just as a raw fan, I think will match perfectly. You know, was it game 1 against the Nuggets?
Mm-hmm.
They lost, and I was just like, it's over. You know, that's it. On to next year. And then that's when you kind of jumped in and were like, you know, it's one game. But yeah, I think we're going to complement each other great. You bring a more in-depth, analytic type view of, you know, this happened in this game and this is probably why they lost, you know, or, you know, they were doing this, which is uncharacteristic. And I'm going to bring most nights in a loss, you know, we lost because this guy didn't hit a shot, or, you know, we won because we're the greatest team in the world.
And we'll get into it with the offseason stuff, but they're, you know, looking ahead of the offseason, you understand the salary cap and stuff like that better than I ever could, because A, I don't like, you know, that type of numbers and counting numbers like that. And B, you have a more, you know, accounting, a financial background, and I don't. Whereas, you know, the draft is here in a few days, and I understand college basketball players because I've seen a lot of them in person. So it's more than just, you know, where we are as fans or anything like that. Like, just following this NBA team alone, we bring unique elements, I think, or I hope we will bring unique elements to this podcast compared to each other. But let's get into the postseason. Let's recap the postseason. There's going to be I think we're going to have a bunch of social media channels that I'm not actually sure what all the names are. I will say that right from the jump. But that'll probably be in the description of this podcast. There's a Twitter account, Facebook page, stuff like that you can follow us for updates and analysis and all that stuff on a day-to-day basis. but I don't know the names, so I can't actually say that. But in future podcasts, I will understand the names, or I will know the names, and I'll be able to say, hey, follow this account. But right now, I actually don't know it. So I'm going to just put it in the description of this podcast. So if you're listening back months later, wondering why I didn't mention it, that's because I actually don't know the names. Austin created all that. But no, let's talk about the 2020 postseason. I still think this, even though I want this podcast to be somewhat evergreen, I think this will always be on everybody's mind for a while, especially as we embark on this new season coming up. Just in general, when you think about the 2020 postseason or the season in general, what are you going to remember from the Lakers title run?
Well, I think it was a challenging season in general. You're in the heat of the regular season, and then you get a stoppage. I think early March. I think it was when they stopped, and then you pick it up in September. Was it? I think September 30th may have been the first game.
I don't know the dates off.
I don't know exactly myself, but it was just a crazy season. I think this season will be remembered by basketball fans forever. But the postseason, I think it was highlighted for the Lakers. Do this for Kobe. Do this for Kobe. I think that was probably their biggest motivator.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, as you see behind me, there's 5 Kobe jerseys sitting there.
Yeah.
For me, that was my perspective. Like,
mm-hmm.
You have to go win this for Kobe. As a Lakers fan in general, I was expecting a championship when the season started. When AD decided, when they made that trade for AD, I was like, it's in the books. Like, we got this. But then when Kobe died, I was like, okay, this changes things. It's not about Lakers basketball. It's, we got to win this for Kobe. And so I think that's what it came down to when you put the postseason together as a whole. But I think, that's.
I'm really glad you mentioned the jerseys because we definitely glossed over that in the first, 15 minutes of this podcast. And that was really what I wanted the first thing to mention because Austin went into a lot of effort into making this his official background. When I said, hey, let's do this, or I suggested this Lakers podcast, he went all out, bought a microphone, got these jerseys hung up in the back. So, I'm glad you mentioned the jerseys because it showed how much effort you already put into this now that this podcast is, 2 days old. For me, you kind of mentioned it, but what I will remember the season being is because of all the COVID stuff, obviously, and the shutdown, the start back up. And I think everyone was quick to suggest that, hey, maybe this title comes with an asterisk because of it was in a bubble and all this stuff. And mostly because everyone wants to discredit LeBron any chance they can get when you're a LeBron hater like that. But for me, I think it's the quite opposite. I believe that was the first pro championship and post, the COVID, not post-COVID, but post after sports being shut down. And they were in this bubble. And I remember vividly the day after the finals had ended, or 2 days after, and you saw insight videos from the Lakers social media channel of these players going home, like getting off the airport. And it just hit me like they were discussing the last time they had seen the real world. And it just hit me how strange that was just in general. And so it felt like they put so much work into one goal and they accomplished that goal and forget everything else. At the end of the day, that's what you want when you're a sports team. But given everything else that was going on around them, the surrounding, the situation, all that stuff, for me, that it just meant so much more for that team to do it. And that's what I will remember is just how much work went into that. Even though maybe it didn't seem like it if you had just started watching when the bubble started and until it ended, or maybe you just watched the big series down the road as well. But it was such a crazy season in general, and with the shutdown and all that stuff. I mean, at one point we went to a couple Lakers games on the road in like November of last year. And that felt like 4 years ago by the time the Lakers had won the title for that year. So it was such a strange year. And for the Lakers to ultimately become the team that won the title, I think it just meant that much more. And I don't buy the BS on the asterisks. I don't know how, credible that take was. I don't know how many people actually came up with that idea. But for me, it probably meant more than a lot of other titles because of just everything that went into it as well. So let's talk about specific moments rather than just overall postseason thoughts. When I created this outline, I stole the best one. So I'll let Austin lead off with his favorite moment, which isn't really his favorite moment. It's my moment, but I'll let him go with the second favorite moment.
I don't know if you saw the update to the outline, what I put. I will stick with that because I think in total, just the feeling that I had. But it was, finals game 6, the clinching moments. Just like that relief, like we did it, like as a fan, like we did it for Kobe, we did it. And, 10 years, I think. Yeah, 10 years was the last time. And so it's like for an organization like the Lakers, like you expect championships. And for them to go 10 years, like that's a big deal. I think it was a 7-year playoff drought. And then, you're back in the playoffs. Okay. 10 years since your title, check, we did that. But just that moment, just relief, joy, emotional. I just remember holding the bottle of champagne, letting it drip out all over me. It was a special moment. We got to share that together. Mallory was there with us. It was
his wife.
Yes, Mallory is my wife. It was just a good moment, probably the 2 top people in this world that I would want to share that moment with was there. And so it was great. I think about it all the time and I still get the goosebumps.
I put in the outline that we should show that video, mostly because I'm not super tech savvy. I don't have that video available here in this podcast, but maybe in a future podcast, we'll call back to it. Maybe if we do actually get enough people that are interested in this podcast and interested in that video in particular, maybe I will share it. There's a couple of them as well. To say that we were both not completely sober would be the best way to describe that night. It was awesome. We couldn't have done a podcast, I will say, after that game.
It would have been interesting.
My favorite moment was, I think, the best moment of the playoffs, other than maybe winning the title. And it's because, you obviously wanted that moment, but I had got to the outline first since I created it. But it was Anthony Davis's game-winning 3-pointer at the buzzer, game 2 of the Western Conference Finals. It just felt like that game was getting away from the Lakers. The Nuggets had scored the last 11 points and led by 1 with 2.1 seconds to go. And AD hits the game winner. And this is one of the few games that we weren't watching together in the postseason. I think of the games we watched all but a few together, but this is one of the few. And that was when I realized that, hey, I might actually be a real Lakers fan now, because I ran around my basement by myself celebrating after AD had hit that 3. It wasn't LeBron who hit it. Nobody was around for me to watch me celebrate, and I was just going crazy. And we can get into the whole, just how much that shot maybe changed the postseason in general, because you never know what happens in a series like that if he doesn't hit that. Basketball series are so weird in general like that. That just felt like a big momentum. And for me, I came through this as a LeBron fan, but AD, watching him play this postseason was so special. He was his instincts on defense are incredible. I'm a big defensive guy in general when I'm watching basketball, and AD is one of my favorite players to watch now on that end of the floor. He's just so incredible. And then just to see him come through with that shot, I don't know. I'll let you talk because as a lifelong Lakers fan, maybe it meant more to you. But for me, that was one of my favorite moments from the postseason that didn't involve spending time with you or LeBron.
I think that was the turning point for the Lakers in the postseason. Like it was just game 2, but they had lost game 1. If they lose this game, they're down 0-2. It's not a big deal, but I personally find myself thinking that I think game 2 is probably the second most crucial game in a series. If you're leading, if you're up 1-0, if you win game 2, that's a 2-0 lead. If you're down 0-1, and you lose that next game, you're down 0-2. So for AD to hit that shot, I kind of checked out of that game. I was still watching, but the realistic person in me was like, there's probably little chance. The Lakers weren't an outstanding 3-point shooting team. I'm like, they didn't need a 3 to win the game. So, but when that shot went down, I jumped up screaming, and it was I have such a hard time just explaining the feeling. Because honestly, it's not something you can explain. Like you have to be there and feel that energy. But I mean, I just yelled like just a pure joy yelling. And I just at that moment I was like, okay, I was like, I'm here. This is it. Like that was a game where I personally thought the Lakers were, we're not going to lose a series. We're not going to miss out on this opportunity to bring this championship home. And it was, I love that. I love seeing the replays of that shot just because it was so monumental for the series. And later, the next day, I actually, they were showing clips of AD running back to the bench, and he yelled Kobe.
Yeah.
It was just amazing. I'm like, low key, I'm getting emotional right now just thinking about it.
I was about to say this is why I'm looking forward to doing this podcast with you, because this shot went down basically 2 months ago, and you still are somewhat speechless, emotional. It's hard for you to put it in words because it just meant so much to you. I do want to clarify, because I think people who are watching this podcast probably think you're an idiot at this point. The Lakers did not lose game 1. They did lose game 1 in the other series against the Rockets, but
that's true.
In the Blazers. But yes, I knew you knew that, but
That's
you were
true.
confusing with the
Okay.
series. But I just wanted to say that because you had now said it twice, and I wanted people to know that Austin does know what he's talking about. He was just confusing series. But yeah, no, it still was a big moment in this series, though, because the Nuggets won game 3. And if they don't win game 2, the Lakers don't win game 2, they're theoretically down 2-1 after 3 games, maybe. I mean, again, you don't know how series go. But I thought you brought up a good point, though. We don't really have to get into a whole lot, but you said at that moment you thought, hey, the Lakers aren't going to lose a series. For me, I thought that the Lakers just got better as the series went on throughout the postseason. And it's one of the things I enjoyed about this team was that, there was those stumbles in game 1, as you've alluded to, of multiple series. But I thought once this team figured out someone defensively, they had a game plan for them, and they would take away your best option. It seemed like they were so smart and wired that way that they had a game plan for everybody later in the series. Like, hey, you give 7 chances with a team, the Lakers are going to figure out a way to beat you because on the defense end, they're that focused. And so for me, that was one of my favorite aspects of the entire postseason was because this team, in the regular season, it's hard to tell. It's just one game, and in the middle of January or whatever it is, like maybe you don't always have that game plan, or you maybe don't put in that much work on that end of the floor. But for the Lakers, they knew by the end of the series we would have the perfect game plan against this team on the defense end, and I think that was noticeable throughout the postseason. I think we wanted to get into maybe a couple players that aren't LeBron and AD, right? I think basketball in general, it's obviously it's even in that sport more than maybe than other sports. It's a team game, and maybe role players don't get as much credit as they should, especially on a championship team. So I think we wanted to spend a little bit of time here talking about our favorite role player, at least from the postseason. So we'll start with you, Austin, because it's been a while since you talked already. So who is your favorite role player, or the role player that you wanted to highlight from the 2020 postseason?
I wanted to talk about Keith Morris. I think he played a very pivotal role in the Lakers beating the Rockets. It only took 5 games for them to win that series, but there are 2 games, I believe games 2 and 5, where he just shot lights out. And so I think ultimately the Lakers beat the Rockets in 7 games, no matter what. But I think his play in that series, just being thrown into the starting lineup, mid playoffs, was really key for them to move forward. And then there was also a game against the Nuggets where it was just spectacular, just on the offensive side. But I think he, in aspects of him being a waiver claim guy, and then coming into just being a bench guy, coming in to relieve somebody, and then just to be thrown into the starting lineup against the Rockets. I think that spoke volume to his ability, to be an extra guy for this team. But yeah, just I really think his play in the series with the Rockets will go overlooked. But for me, I think the way he was on the offensive side of the ball really helped them overcome them.
Yeah, and a player like that, you don't expect them for a whole series or a whole postseason to come through or whatever, but to impact one game of the postseason, that's a huge deal. You need 16 wins to come away with a title. If you get one win from a player like that, I think that's definitely a great return of investment in terms of how much the Lakers had to pay to actually have his services. So I think that was a good call. The role player I wanted to highlight is someone that your wife is in love with. And I think this might rub you the wrong way, just based off your guys' interaction about that. But it's Alex Caruso. I enjoy watching Alex Caruso play basketball. He is a lot of fun to watch. Someone who, again, plays really good defensively. On offense, he's a straight line driver who will cut and constantly move the ball around. He obviously leaves a little bit to desired on that end, and especially in terms of shooting the ball. But the way he is defensively, the way he meshes with LeBron in particular, to talk about his story and just how incredible it is in the scope of this Lakers title run is just impressive to me. He was undrafted, he was a G League player, and then he was a big time player for a team that needed him to win the finals. And so he's someone I'm going to enjoy more, seeing even a bigger role. I know he mentioned on JJ Redick's podcast a couple days ago that he believes he can do more on the offensive end. So I'm looking forward to seeing if there's a step in his development as well, if he can bring another aspect, because I still think his better days are ahead for Alex Caruso. But this was obviously a good run for him, and I enjoyed watching him play basketball a lot, especially in this bubble atmosphere.
Yeah, I do. I have a love hate with AC. I think he works so hard, and that was his mindset. Undrafted G League,
Mhm.
to champion, NBA champion, and so I think for him it was be the hardest worker every day, and that's why he's an NBA champion. He worked harder than anyone else to be where he is, and I think he's got great potential. Like you can see it. You see flashes of it all the time. Him jamming on 7-foot centers, and so I look forward to seeing him develop further. I hope he sticks around on the team,
Mhm.
and I look forward to it because I think he is. I think he can easily be a fan favorite.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point that undrafted. It speaks to his work ethic for why he was able to get to where he was, being undrafted. Because we'll get into it here in a little bit, but the Lakers have the 28th pick in the draft, and there's no guarantee that person is ever a major contributor in the way Alex Caruso was this postseason. And he was undrafted. He was a time in a G League, and as you alluded to, it speaks to his work ethic and his drive for the reason why he was able to make plays down the stretch for the team when they needed him the most. So let's get into that, the offseason talk. I don't want to dive too deep into this. We'll have plenty of podcasts throughout the offseason discussing basically anything that happens of relevance because we're just kind of counting down the days until the start of the NBA season, which is a lot sooner than I expected, starting before Christmas of this year. Which is insane. We can get into that when it gets closer as well. But the first talking point here of the offseason is this team going to run it back? Most teams in any sport in this situation, when you win a title, you get the luxury of, hey, let's run it back. It doesn't seem like the Lakers are going to get that opportunity just because there's so much unknown contract-wise. Maybe you can provide a little more insight than me in that regard. But is this team going to be able to run it back? And what do you envision taking place this offseason?
I will say they have the opportunity to. I think if you have LeBron and AD on your team, then you have to say we have a chance. What they can do this offseason as filling out their team, that'll weigh heavily on their realistic chances. I think it's JaVale, KCP, Rondo, and Avery Bradley all have player options. And so I think for me, KCP and Avery Bradley are key guys that you want to bring back. I know KCP can opt out, and the Lakers can sign him because I believe they have bird rights for KCP, meaning they can sign him above cap, and that's not something that other teams will be able to do. And so I think the Lakers have a little bit of advantage for bringing KCP back. Whether they do that, that's a different story. But I think it's going to be key for how they fill out this roster. You're going to want guys that are going to space the floor. That way LeBron can back a guy down. Or you're going to want the floor space so Caruso can, dive to the lane and, get the ball, easy buckets. And so I think it's going to be hard. There's not a lot of cap space for them. They have a couple options that they can designate to some guys. But just in general, I don't think the cap is increasing just because of COVID. And so it puts a lot of teams in tight spots. And I think there's only 4 or 5 teams in the league that have cap space. And so it's gonna depend on what they do. There's a lot of options. There's trade options for them to go out and seek guys. They have a couple options that they can can give some guys. But it's going to be interesting what they do in the month and a half they have to to get through this.
Yeah, the offseason stuff is admittedly my least favorite part about sports in general. But we're doing this podcast, so we're going to keep updating the fans as well throughout all this with our own insight. But this is always my least favorite part, so I'll let Austin carry it a little bit more on that end. But it just feels like it's constantly, hey, rumors this, rumors that, and I tend to not care until the person's actually on the team. But I will try my best to pay attention. I am interested, though, in the shorter offseason in general and just how much that's going to have an effect on not only the Lakers, but in general, every NBA team that was in the bubble. I think that is going to be one of the more interesting storylines entering the season. But let's talk about storylines for the offseason scope. And that's one of the last things here in the outline. What is your storyline that you're watching here in the offseason for the Lakers?
For me, it's, are they going to bring in this third all-star? Are they going to bring in this big-time third guy? And I've seen a lot of DeMar DeRozan, Kyle Lowry, Victor Oladipo. There's one more, but I can't think of who it is. And so I think that's going to be a big thing because, if you can bring in a third star, that's great. That's going to really hamper on what you can do with the rest of your cap money. And so that would change things drastically. But I think that's the biggest thing that I'm watching and really looking forward to. I would love to see that happen, but I think it's got to be the right person.
Mm-hmm.
But go ahead.
That might be where we end up disagreeing. Maybe before this year I would have said something otherwise, but now that we've seen it with the Lakers winning with two stars essentially, a lot of teams are built this way now in the NBA as well. It just feels like this was a more enjoyable experience, I thought. Because when you get into that 3-star roster build, I've watched them with the Heat and some extent the Cavs. That third star is disgruntled because they're not as effective. And I think maybe there was an element to that because everybody wanted Kyle Kuzma to be the third star, right? In this year. And, in some of his better games in January or February, I can't remember what the stretch was when AD or LeBron was out. And it was just like, hey, this guy could be the third star. You can see it right there. And that just ends up what ends up happening in basketball is the whole cliche that there's only one ball is true. And that's why, maybe you see the third star not being as consistent. But yeah, no, I mean, I will defer to you always when it comes to the way the Lakers roster should be built. Although I do think the Lakers front office in general gets a little more leeway this offseason than they probably had in the past. I think everybody was questioning some of their decisions the last 2 off seasons, I thought. And it ended up working out. So maybe they get a little more leeway this offseason if they make a move. And that makes fans question it a little bit. So that'll be interesting to see. I'll just mention the NBA draft just because it's a few days away. I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert on the NBA draft by any means. I do obviously cover college basketball, so that helps. But I think I'm just looking forward to not necessarily what the Lakers do at pick 28, but just the draft. In any sport, I get into the draft maybe a couple days right before it. I'm like, hey, who are actually some of the better players that we should be looking out for? And then suddenly I pretend like I'm an expert. And so that part is enjoyable. There will be ways to gamble on the draft, I'm sure. Now I'm looking forward to that. But it's just the first sign of maybe off-season stuff officially happening. And I think that's exciting, even though it doesn't feel like it should be this early. Do you have any thoughts on the draft in general, or like me, are you just not really that prepared yet to talk about the NBA draft? I mean, at some point, we're going to maybe record a podcast based off the draft, so we'll have better insight then.
I'm not prepared for this draft at all. Without college basketball, it's who's there, who's going to be there at 28, those back guy, the into the first round guys. Like you don't. Yeah, I might be able to name 3 or 4 dudes, but those are probably going to be the top 3 or 4 picks maybe.
Yeah.
So yeah, without college basketball finishing their season, and we don't get that March Madness, it's hard. I can't imagine what it's like for the front offices to bring guys in, because you're looking at film that's a year old.
Yeah.
Right now, roughly a year old. So it's got to be hard for them. And then if it's hard for them, it's going to be very, very hard for guys like us to talk about it. So
no, that's a really good point. And I think we saw in the NFL just how maybe the challenges of drafting when you can't always see the person or see the player in person. So no, maybe that will make the draft even more interesting. I think it just will be interesting because you'll start to see some trades and maybe there will be some actually juices flowing about the NBA here in a couple of days. Again, we will probably have a podcast of some sort. I don't know if it'll be the night of or the night after, what it will end up being, but that will probably be our first official podcast. That's not the first official podcast. So number 2 is what people would call that normally when you're counting. So we'll send off with a quick trade rumor. I think this is, again, probably one of my least favorite parts about doing this, but we probably have to talk about it because it's a relatively big name that was rumored to the Lakers a couple of days ago, right before we decided to start doing a podcast. Maybe by the time you listen to this, it doesn't matter. But DeMar DeRozan was rumored to be involved in a trade to the Lakers. Maybe there were other players, but he was the big one. Would you want that? You were talking about a third star. Is DeRozan the third star that you want the Lakers to have?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think it's a right fit. This is kind of secondhand information I was reading what other people were saying about it, and it makes a lot of sense. He's not a big outside shooter.
Yeah.
And so he's not going to draw that attention out. And so that's I think that was really beneficial for the Lakers in this title run that they just had was, any guy out there, though not a great 3-point shooter, you still need to step out on because they can hit shots. And so, it's probably the same story with DeRozan, but from what I read, he's not that willing to take threes. I think he's more comfortable driving and kicking, which is what LeBron does. And so I think from that aspect, it wouldn't be a smart move. It's going to take up a lot of cap. It's not going to leave you a lot of options to go out and get these other pieces that you need. But also you're going to have to send them probably, I think it was Danny Green, Kuz, and this 28th pick.
Yeah.
Maybe that's worth it. I personally don't think it would be because, although Danny Green wasn't crazy consistent in the playoffs, I still think he's a guy I want on my team taking these same shots that he was taking. And I still love what Kuz brings to the table. I think his offense hasn't improved as much as probably what people were thinking when they were saying he could be the third star. But I think his defense is the reason why he will stay on this team. I remember saying he needed to leave this team because he was terrible on defense. And then once we got into the playoffs, I was like, I can't believe this. Like Kuz needs to be out there playing defense on some of these big stars because to me, from my eyes, he improved that much. But yeah, I just don't think DeRozan is a smart option. Just for the way the team was constructed this year. Obviously, there are options they could do to build the team around his player type and how it would mesh with LeBron and AD. But just from a logical team meshing perspective, I don't think it would work out very well.
Yeah, your analysis on Kuzma exemplified what you're going to bring to this podcast. At one point you wanted him off the team, and then you were crediting him. This is why we have Austin here. He brings that real, raw fan energy to this podcast that I'm looking forward to. No, you said it all. You said it way better than I ever will. What did the Lakers struggle at this past year? It was their half-court offense. DeMar DeRozan, in particular, I think, would hinder you even more on that end. I mean, it would, as you said, you can't stretch the floor. Maybe teams are clogging the lane even more on you. And I think it would just further enhance a weakness that the Lakers already had. And at the same time, you're giving up, I think, real strengths of this team in terms of on the defensive end, like you were talking about with Kuzma and even Danny Green. And then whatever that 28th pick ends up being. Obviously, that pick might be traded by the time we record the next podcast, but those two players in general, not worth parting off with for DeRozan. I'm in complete agreement with you. When I saw that was my initial take as well. So glad we're on the same page there. That may not always be the case, but I believe it was important for us to be on the same page, that aspect. Otherwise, we couldn't do this podcast again. Any final thoughts, Austin?
No. I really look forward to seeing how the draft shakes out. Mm-hmm. I'm very interested how the free agency goes. Yeah. That's just I love that stuff. Like, I know I love the offseason transactions. What are the Lakers going to do about their cap? How are they going to, put a mid-level exception for this guy? Mm-hmm. And then, fill the rest of that. Like, I love that stuff so much. And so I look forward to that. And I'm just really excited to see how it plays out.
Again, that's why we are the perfect balance, because it's not my favorite thing until they're actually on the team. Hopefully this entire podcast provided a glimpse of what this podcast plans to be here on out. Again, we don't know the entire schedule just yet, but I'm pretty sure we'll have a better idea by the time we record a second podcast. On all our social media channels, we will have a better idea of the schedule as well. We'll have more updates on that end, so follow that. It's in some form. It's called the Lakers Theory, but all that will be in the description of this podcast. But that's going to do it for the first edition of the Lakers Theory podcast. Hopefully, you will enjoy this podcast by fans, for fans, and hopefully we'll get better along the way. With this podcast. Really, it's just a chance for Austin and I to talk and fire off all our Lakers takes that we've been holding on to or texting each other about for the past year and a half. For Austin Case, I'm Shane Jackson. Thank you for listening, and go Lakers.